My paper today is based on one chapter of my dissertation, Asia First, China and American Conservatism, from 1937 to 1965. But before I turn to William F. Noland, I would just like to say how pleased I am to be here today to help celebrate the centennial of such a special library. I'd also like to say that the challenge of finding the ideal dissertation topic is one that measures up to the challenge of passing oral examinations. And I had in mind a project that would marry a history of foreign relations with a history of popular politics, but I wasn't sure that that was possible. But the political collections at the Bancroft Library showed me that it was. So again, I'm very happy today to be here to celebrate this archive. The man who assumed the role of Senate Majority Leader in May of 1953 was often regarded as an opportunist by opponents on both sides of the aisle. Forceful, unsubtle, Bill Nolan knew how to capitalize upon fortune's prospects to further his own ambitions and causes. During the Cold War, he transformed anti-communist China into a watershed issue in American politics. By declaring that Asia was just as, if not more important than Europe to US foreign policy, he equipped Republicans with means to condemn the Truman administration and conservative elites an opening to recover their party from liberal consensus. Outside of Washington, his efforts awakened the grassroots right to the possibilities of party power. They also earned him the somewhat derisive nickname of the Senator from Formosa. Nolan's senatorial tenure, which lasted from 1945 to 1958, reflected right-wing ideology and action during that period. His biography and political successes exemplified the new face of elite Republican conservatism: virulent anti-communism, Pacific internationalism, and defense-oriented state expansion. An examination of his stance on China reveals the making of a significant national career. But this is also a story about California, for William Fife Noland was nothing if not a proud Californian, and his politics were directly influenced by a keen sense of regionalism. The precocious scion of the family that owned the Oakland Tribune, he seemed destined for a life in politics. Even as a child of 8, he preferred standing on a soapbox and reciting the attributes of representative government to going outside and participating in sports. In 1932, Noland was elected California State Assemblyman at the age of 24 and moved up to the state Senate just 2 years later. He steadily built a pro-infrastructure, anti-union reputation until Pearl Harbor was attacked and he enlisted in the Army. But Noland's political career could not wait even for war to end. In August 1945, Governor Earl Warren, an old family friend, appointed him to fill the U.S. Senate seat made vacant by Hiram Johnson's death. He arrived just in time for the beginning of the Cold War. As a junior senator, Noland struggled to find his signature issue. Impatient to make his mark, he chafed under rules of seniority and clashed numerous times with Robert Taft of Ohio, the Republican leader of the Senate and America's most prominent conservative. Then came the end of the Chinese Communist Revolution in 1949. Nolan wasted no time in making hay out of the communist victory and Chiang Kai-shek's exile to Formosa. His conversion can be discerned quite clearly. The congressional record tells us that as late as 1948, Hawaiian statehood appeared more important to Nolan than China. But in 1950, he delivered 115 Senate speeches on the Far East alone, mostly railing against Truman's errors in foreign policy. Many of the accusations Nolan leveled against the White House and the State Department were familiar. The Yalta Agreement had allowed Soviet troops into Manchuria, Chiang's nationalist government had not received enough aid, and so forth. Yet Nolan made this line of reasoning fresh by making connections between the communization of China to increasing statism at home. His statement that, quote, no Republican president would have entered into the Yalta Agreement, end quote, was significant, if simple. By making bygone foreign policy a partisan issue, he inserted an alternate version of the Sino-American relationship that was wishful thinking, but an infinitely useful ideological construction nonetheless. By serving notice that politics did not stop at the water's edge, Nolan revitalized Far Eastern relations as distinctly conservative territory. Within the context of the Korean War and the beginning of McCarthyism, his well-publicized expertise endowed the elite right with a foreign policy leader who spurred a literal broadening of conservative ideology. Thanks to Noland, American conservatism embraced a truly global stance. "We can no more return to isolationism than an adult can return to childhood," he said. His words refer to America and its newly awakened sense of global responsibility, but they also addressed former isolationists turned reluctant internationalists. The transition was difficult, but the Free China, Asia First argument not only gave GOP elites a potent weapon against the Democratic administration, it also presented mid and far Western conservatives with a way to challenge Eastern-based moderates, like Thomas Dewey, Henry Cabot Lodge, and Nelson Rockefeller for party control. The adoption of an Asia First stance was a natural choice for somebody born and bred on the Pacific coast. A democratic China was a cause close to Nolan's heart and to his constituency. His background as a native Californian granted him special authority to speak as one with firsthand knowledge of American life on the Pacific Rim. In particular, he could confidently relate what Free China meant to the West Coast and the danger Red China posed to national security. Noland was not the only politician to visit Asia or assert the Far East's importance, but only he consistently spoke as the elite representative of an increasingly important state. "I happen to come from a state where the waters of the Pacific wash upon our shores, and we saw World War II break out there," Nolan declared in 1949. "And we certainly do not believe they are giving proper attention to that part of the world." World War II had instilled the American West Coast with a sense of its own strategic importance, one that rivaled the Eastern Seaboard's traditional demand of focus on Western Europe as both trading partner and ideological ally. So it was as a rising star and representative of an electorally important state that Nolan stood before the podium at the Republican Convention in 1952. He insisted that, quote, "non-military expenditures be limited drastically, and that even in the field of military expenditures, the American people get $1 worth of value for every dollar spent, and that the funds be spent on building muscle and not fat in the defense organization," end quote. While urging fiscal responsibility, he was careful not to propose cuts to the Defense Department's budget. Nolan's stance was the first instance of a conservative leader advocating the continuation of high federal spending, and it set the tone for future Republicans who would consider defense reductions out of the question altogether. The call to arms diversified the GOP platform and began the party's official association with the building of a defense state. The senators' push to secure the Pacific via defense spending owed much to the Golden State's post-war economy. California was the single largest beneficiary of federal defense dollars. The Cold War arms race represented a financial boom for the American West, providing employment in defense as well as requiring services from the private sector. The promise of a well-paying job, as much as the promise of good weather, inspired a steady stream of westward migration that made California the most populous state in the Union by 1962. After 1945, you can see, anti-communism California was, for many of its residents, both an ideological and a financial dogma. But defense dollars weren't enough. As it turned out, voters across the country were dissatisfied with the direction of the Cold War and the prospect of another Democratic administration. Republicans won big in 1952, recapturing the White House and a Senate majority. Californians re-elected Nolan by an unprecedented margin. His victory allowed him to take over the chair of the Republican Policy Committee, the second highest position in the GOP Senate. He would ascend even higher just a few months later. After learning of his cancer diagnosis, Robert Taft asked Nolan to serve as acting majority leader. As Taft explained, nobody can push him around. Nobody included the new president. After 2 decades of exile from the White House, all Republicans might have enjoyed their electoral gains. Eisenhower, however, was much too moderate for most conservatives' taste, and the intra-party battle continued. Noland interpreted the majority leader's duty as a mandate to preserve the integrity of the legislative branch and the balance of power, especially when the executive happened to be a member of his own party. Although he made public overtures of unity, he jealously guarded his sphere of influence, and interactions with Eisenhower were painful and conflict-ridden. Nolan's obstinacy was such that the president once described him as a very large infant. He was over 6 feet too, so that's very large. The McCarthy censure of 1954 brought the rift into sharp relief. Contradicting Eisenhower's private wishes, Nolan voted against the censure on grounds that it would inhibit free speech and infringe upon the Senate's internal investigation. Simultaneously, he sought to widen his influence over the direction of diplomatic relations. Whether they were Democrat or Republican, Nolan spared little deference for the authorities in charge of foreign policy, a habit showcased during the 1954 debate over the controversial Bricker Amendment. Under the proposed legislation, no American president or world government would be allowed to make unilateral decisions that could, quote, undermine the sovereignty of the United States, end quote. Its primary target was Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution, which allowed the president to enter into treaties even when Congress was not in session. This was a practice that amounted to tyranny, declared right-wing elites. Remembering how Truman had bypassed Senate approval for the Korean War by appealing directly to the United Nations, Nolan voted for the amendment. Although it was ultimately defeated, he made his devotion to originalism clear. I am certain that this president does not believe that Congress should be a rubber-stamped body, he declared. Nolan's duties as majority leader did not prevent him from writing his own legislative proposals. He hoped to thwart any Chinese communist attempt to join the UN, arguing that membership would legitimize Mao's government and generate communist revolution all over Asia. In May 1953, Noland introduced resolutions that urged the president to withdraw American membership from the UN if Communist China was either admitted or its delegation recognized as the Republic of China's representatives. What the senator proposed was a new sort of American isolationism. Rather than a return to a strict definition of the word, this version meant the execution of foreign policy unfettered by consideration of the UN. Nolan believed the UN was better off dominated by constitutional nations with experience in democracy. If the organization's bylaws could not allow such domination, then the US should not take part. The potential admission of Communist China brought this issue to a head. Despite the right's silence on the paradox at hand, Noland and others like him credited the UN with enough prestige to trigger a communist revolution in the Far East, even as they belittled it with assertions of American sovereignty above all international coalitions. By the mid-1950s, it was clear that Chiang Kai-shek was not the capable leader his American advocates had touted. While Nolan's rhetoric may have indicated otherwise, he was not one of those blind supporters. After making multiple trips to the Far East during the early 1950s, he was more aware of the Generalissimo's deficiencies than other conservatives. The senator wrote in 1953 that, quote, Chiang aims at personal dictatorship, is hostile to the idea of democracy, but favors the idea of monarchy, end quote. These were hardly the qualifications of the democratic counterpart that America wanted in the Far East. Yet Nolan remained undaunted. His background as a Californian perhaps allowed him to separate Chiang from the promise and symbol of a democratic China. At any rate, he continued to combat Asian communism in any way possible. Shelling in the Formosan Straits and the imprisonment of American civilians and airmen provided him with ample opportunity through the late 1950s. It seemed that Bill Nolan could stay forever in the Senate, enjoying the benefits of seniority and a powerful position. But his eyes were on a bigger prize. That man wanted to be president of the United States, recalled his daughter Emmeline. He never admitted it publicly, but that's where his whole career was shooting for. The stepping stone to that goal was the governorship of California, and Nolan decided to run for Sacramento in 1958. If all went as planned, he would be president by 1961. Suffering perhaps from a case of Potomac myopia, he failed to account for the California GOP itself. Noland had spent the majority of his career in Washington and was out of sync with local politics. And the GOP in California far from welcomed his announcement. They were, in fact, resentful. His candidacy threatened to upend the party's shaky power structure, and it was largely taken as an act of cannibalism upon Republican Governor Goodwin Knight. After a bitter primary, Noland won the right to go head-to-head with Edmund G. Pat Brown. His campaign was beset by fundamental problems, however. First, he didn't have the full support of his party. Then came the decision to stay in Washington until Congress adjourned in August. In the meantime, his wife, daughters, and daughter-in-law stumped across the state, with Helen Nolan committing several PR blunders along the way. Finally, and most seriously, he was saddled with right to work, an outdated issue that came to define his whole campaign. Prop 18 was an open-shop initiative opposed by the powerful California unions. When forced to address the matter, Nolan floundered. Using the vocabulary of anti-communism, he classified the battle between union and open-shop employees as one of tyranny versus freedom. Those words condemned Nolan as an antiquated McCarthyite who wanted to return California to the 19th century. His constituents recognized him as a foreign policy leader, and Nolan did little to convince them that he was willing to take on the intricacies of state government. November's count revealed that nearly 60% of voters had cast their ballots for Brown. It was a loss that spelled the end of Nolan's life in politics. 1958 was a reckless end to a complex, significant career. Nolan's contributions to American conservatism were many. He provided internationalized leadership that used moralized rhetoric on a global stage. His posturing on the Senate floor was backed by a willingness to use military intervention to achieve American security and dominance in world affairs. Even the troubled relationship Nolan had with the UN held enduring lessons. While the nation recognized its heightened stature and responsibility in the international sphere, that didn't mean its sovereignty was to be inhibited by world government. As the exemplar of democracy, the US had license to act when it wanted and how it wanted. Cold War California was the ideal breeding ground for a politician like Nolan. Young, brash, and determined to signal a new post-war order, the senator embodied many of the qualities of his home state. Likewise, his demands for an anti-communist China reflected the vested interests of his Pacific Rim constituents. And it was with the Asia First doctrine that he experienced his greatest successes as a policy advocate. California also proved to be Nolan's undoing. However, as we can see from the current political and diplomatic situation, his legacy has endured. Thank you.
It's an honor to be back, and up here it evokes wonderful memories on my part. I spent a glorious year here 20 years ago while I was in graduate school. When I was in graduate school back east, in the mid-'80s, early to mid-'80s, the new Western history had just started to peek its head up into books and articles about new interpretations of the American West, but had not yet become the runaway academic train that it did become in the 1990s. As a consequence, my graduate training in American history didn't really do much on the West back east. I remember a professor of mine at Princeton said, "Oh, you do Western history? That's west of the Appalachia?" The good thing about it was that all the books on the West were in the library, unchecked out. They were always there. But I came out here to spend a year at the Bancroft working on my dissertation, 1986, 1987, and really learned about the West in the Bancroft Library. It's of course a library for California and of Californiana, an extraordinary one at that, but I think we should be reminded how glorious it is in the entire trans-Mississippi American West as a collection. When I was here, my graduate fellowship was $500 a month. My apartment in Rockridge that I shared with a friend was $400 each a month. But somehow we made it. I do remember very clearly the first day, my first day at the Bancroft, there was a young woman looking at materials related to Clarence King on the reader's table there, and I was interested in King, and so I introduced myself to her on the very first day, and that was Ann Hyde, a Western historian who trained here at Berkeley with Gunther Barth, and we cemented a friendship then that's lasted these 20 years as friends and colleagues. And in those days, working on our dissertations, whenever one of us had good news, our advisor liked a chapter, or we'd found something interesting in the research findings, whatever, the person who was the recipient of the good news would be taken out by the other for a glass each of red wine at Chez Panisse. That's about how much money we had, but it was glorious. Anyway, I think this I'm going to be a little speculative here. I'm going to talk to you about a book I'm working on, and about all I know about it is what I'm going to tell you now. It's brand new. But I think this book that I'm working on now literally had its origins at the Bancroft, those 20 years ago. I had been steeped and trained in the Civil War as a graduate student, but I did want to do the American West for a dissertation, and my advisors gave me the green light to do so. And I came out here to study the railroad in California. And the Bancroft is the institution, certainly the institution in this part of the world to do that kind of work. And my work on the railroad in opposition to the railroad here in California uncovered a lot of material at a place like the Bancroft that was really striking, that the coming of the Transcontinental Railroad here in the late 1860s, the arrival of it in the late 1860s as a unit, was received out here in California as a revelation. It was received as a kind of redemption for the nation. The railroad was fawned over from the pulpit as something that would bring about the second coming, literally. I read sermons from preachers in the pulpits of places like Oakland who looked to their Bibles very quickly in the Old Testament and found phrases like the exhortation to make straight in the desert a highway for your God, and assumed that that was the railroad. Really powerful, powerful stuff. And that kind of has stuck with me. I wrote about it in my book, but it's stuck with me in terms of this post-Civil War era and the ideas of redemption and even revelation in the American West. This new book I'm working on is called The Redemptive West, at least at this point. It's about the post-Civil War American West, roughly from the late 1860s to the first 2 or 3 generations or decades of the 20th century. It's coincidentally and purposefully timed chronologically to follow the Civil War generation across the divide of the 20th century into the, say, the 20s or thereabouts. It springs from a couple of curious problems I've noticed in Western history, and I'm not alone in this, in which Western historians have done certain things that I don't really agree with. I'm dissatisfied with them. One of them has to do with the stasis of the California dream, or the perceived stasis of it, that we think it's sort of one thing in a sense. And that generally has to do with James Marshall's instantaneous change of life when he reaches down into Sutter's Mill Race and pulls out a nugget of gold. That notion that the California dream has an instantaneous effect upon people, that your life can be changed in an instant, and that that change will be likely accompanied by material gain. That's one California dream, of course. It's real. But I think there's another one that elbows its way into the vision of California in the far west. And it's there in equal importance, I think, and it comes right after and precisely because of the American Civil War. The other dissatisfaction, and I'll develop that in a minute, the other dissatisfaction I have with what Western historians have done, myself included, and some things I've written and ways I lecture to my students, Western historians have carried the day with their colleagues in American history by arguing that the West, because of ferocious, unanswerable questions in many respects about the territorial expansion of slavery, we argue that the West caused the Civil War. That's a compelling argument, really, and we trot out the events and moments of 19th century American history to prove it. The dislocations caused of the Mexican-American War, the resulting hubbub over things like the Wilmot Proviso, the Compromise of 1850, which is merely a postponement of the Civil War that tips the balance of slave and free states in favor of free because of California's admission. Kansas-Nebraska, the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the turmoils born of that. Bleeding Kansas, following in the mid-1850s, which is, for all intents and purposes, a rehearsal of the Civil War in the American West. And then, of course, Lincoln's election tips the balance and the South pulls out. The West is unable, completely unable to stop the war. Western politicians are unable to establish any compromise. Western politicians of the 1850s and 1860s are largely characterized as naive, crude, unskilled, and unimportant. They get more important after the Civil War, but during the decade prior to the Civil War, they're hopeless in terms of stopping the catastrophe. So the war comes. It's the major rupture in American history, and of course its reverberations are felt into today. But Western historians have done a funny thing about life after the war out in the American West. Having proved our point, we think, about the importance of the West and the coming of the war, we let the war drop off the table in the West once Grant accepts Lee's surrender at Appomattox. We forget about it. Instead, we write chapters or entire books, usually called something like The Rise of the West, Growth of the West, the post-frontier nation, something like that. In the last third of the 19th century or early 20th century decades, works which ignore the crisis, the conflagration, and the catastrophe of the Civil War. That doesn't make any sense to me anymore. If you're working on, for instance, the coming of age of a place like Los Angeles, which we usually date to the mid-1880s or thereabouts, we must remember just how proximate the Civil War was to the people who were there or came there. It was as close to them as the 1980s is to us in this room, and of course much more traumatic. People moved west because of the Civil War, because they wanted to get away, because they wanted to heal, physically, emotionally, or otherwise. And most of them came to the American West on the Transcontinental Railroad, back to those images of the railroad for a minute, which was, if anything, a device by which the nation was supposed to be drawn together after the war, as if it were a gigantic suture, stitching together the torn asunder North and South. The railroad in that regard becomes a wishfully redemptive technological arrival on the landscape. The book I'm trying to work on is about convalescence, the convalescence of the nation and the convalescence of its people in the West following 4 years of horrible warfare. If the West caused the Civil War, what did the West do to heal the wounds of that war? Western historians have looked for the Civil War in the wrong places. A battle here or a battle there, a little skirmish, Glorieta Pass. Not unimportant, but if you want to look for the Civil War in the American West, it's everywhere. It's everywhere in rhetoric and politics, and Western historians have forgotten that the impact of that war was also felt everywhere out here. My new book is probably going to open with a story of 3 or 4 case study stories of men who came to the Civil War era California as a way to open up this project. And the stories of each of these can be and will be and must be researched at the Bancroft. I'll trot out these figures here briefly. Thomas Starr King, Ralph Waldo Emerson's darling of the East Coast, Unitarian preacher, familiar name to most of you in this room, I suspect. A martyr in death just before Lincoln becomes the greatest martyr in American history. Thomas Starr King moves here to California and takes on a church in San Francisco and is a very, very provocative, interesting thinker, horrified by the Civil War, horrified by the damage done by the Civil War, sees in places like Yosemite the hope for unification and a closeness to God. His death in 1864 is, in virtual martyrdom, seen as a way to unite the nation east and west through the representation of his life as someone who came west and earned the pulpit to comment on the conflagration back east. In death, he was eulogized by John Greenleaf Whittier, and I'll read this several couplets here from a poem that Whittier wrote in his death, and you can see that Starr King's death is this attempt to pull the nation together from the West. Whittier writes, "Let the strong organ with its loftiest swell lift the proud sorrow of the land and tell that the brave sower saw his ripened grain. O east and west, O morn and sunset twain, no more forever. Has he lived in vain who priest of freedom made ye one and told your bridal service from his lips of gold?" Next I'll turn to, or may open the book with, Frederick Law Olmsted, another very familiar figure and familiar to those of us here in the West as well as our colleagues back east. Olmsted, of course, comes west during the war, following his position as head of the United States Sanitary Commission, where he saw the worst of the war up close and personal. He wrote the first important and highly important treatise on Yosemite in 1864, and in that he wrote, "It is a fact of much significance with reference to the temper and spirit which ruled loyal people of the United States during the War of the Great Rebellion, that a livelier susceptibility to the influence of art was apparent, and greater progress in the manifestations of artistic talent was made than in any similar period before in the history of the country." In other words, the stress of the Civil War is productive of great art and great works of art. And I'm reminded in this of the landscape architect Laurie Olin's comment that Central Park is the greatest work of art ever produced in America, and of course, an Olmsted project. What Olmsted does in calling out Yosemite as this very, very special place in the American landscape as early as 1864 is he is key for a shift in the view of nature in America from the sublime, nature as startling, nature as emotive, nature as something that can disrupt your life and your mind, your psyche, to something much more inspiring, relaxing, and even rejuvenating. There's a transition, and the national park movement is precisely dedicated to this after the Civil War. Yosemite is a protection during the Civil War as not quite a national park, but soon will be. And of course, Yellowstone in 1872, perfectly timed with the end of the Civil War. There's a transition that takes place, I think, from the sublime landscapes of Niagara. Niagara is previously the great site of American nature. It's both sublime, but it's also spectacle, because in the early 19th century, it's not uncommon to see people charged a nickel or a penny to gather at the falls to watch barges filled with circus animals go over the falls. So it's got this kind of spectacle feel to it that Yosemite doesn't have that kind of profanity in it. It wouldn't be allowed. And Yosemite and Olmsted's vision helps to pull the vision of nature and the rejuvenation of nature into Western spaces. Key to this, I think, the convalescent key or quality to this has to do actually with the history of medicine. And my third figure is a man named Jonathan Letterman. We heard earlier today about the Presidio. The hospital at the Presidio is Letterman Hospital, named for this man. Jonathan Letterman was a chief surgeon of the Army of the Potomac. He resigns his military commission just before the end of the war, having seen, again, like Olmsted, the worst of the war up close as a surgeon. Resigns his military commission and comes out to Southern California as an oil wildcatter, of all things, and writes the medical history of the Civil War in Ventura, California, which at that time, 1864, must have been about as big as this room, with less people in it. And Letterman writes the medical history of the war in the far West, which offers me the metaphorical opportunity to say the medical history of the Civil War is written in the West, and it's also written in the lives and bodies of people who come west. Letterman's significant as a physician because he had done several things that are critical in terms of treatment of the wounded. He revitalized, if not invented, the United States Ambulance Corps. He also pulls cots of the wounded apart at a uniform distance in sort of early germ theory recognition. And then he does this very interesting thing, which is to pull surgical theaters outside as an act of health, that the wounded will do better if they're operated on in outdoor surgical theaters, which is a wonderful opportunity, too, because I think that in the post-Civil War era, the great outdoors of America becomes the American West, and does so for many respects for this healing quality. And of course, I'm probably going to have to talk about John Muir. Muir is appalled by the war. Muir is a draft dodger, escapes by foot, and walks around basically most of North America for the rest of his life. But appalled by the war, the Wisconsin regiments of boys he grew up with were cannon fodder during the war. And Muir, in many respects, as an escape, begins his long sojourns and walks, but of course ends up in Yosemite. And Yosemite for Muir is the great repose. Lonely, needless to say, but a great and important place for him in the context of the war. So that when Emerson comes to visit Yosemite in 1871 and meets Muir, this glorious moment in American history, a torch is veritably passed. The East, Emerson's nature, defined in the East through the Transcendentalist, becomes our environmental landscape of the American West, and Muir becomes the great and first environmentalist in that. So this is a book very, very caught up in the convalescent landscapes of the American West, convalescence through nature, convalescence through medicine and health. It's going to be a lot about the wounded who come here in the West after the war, and the disabled, and of course the hospitals, the VAs, created for Civil War wounded. I'll probably do a case study of my home state of Colorado, which is very much wrapped up into this convalescent landscape in the post-Civil War. And of course, I'll study California closely. We've misread the evidence out here to see California as only, particularly Southern California, as only a place where pulmonary disease victims go, tuberculosis and other pulmonary distress. It's all about the wounded, too, the Civil War wounded. As a case study in this, the state of Mississippi, admittedly a small and Confederate state, but in the state of Mississippi after the Civil War, the first couple years after the war, 1/4 of the state's annual budget goes to prosthetic devices for Civil War wounded. Now that's a huge percentage, obviously, and probably refracted through the Confederacy, but those kinds of statistics about the impact of the war are things that I'm very, very interested in. Now at the end, I don't know if it's going to work. I don't know if the West is redemptive. Somewhat, yes. The California dream has that feel to it after the war to me. A redemptive feel. It's not just the gold rush, strike it rich, change your life in an instant. It's a convalescence and a remaking of oneself. Think of the African American migrants who come here in the early decades of the 20th century in particular, and what they're searching for as an escape from Jim Crow's South. Even a leader like W.E.B. Du Bois, not a rosy-tinted thinker by any means. W.E.B. Du Bois comes to California in 1913 and claims he's seen the Promised Land. That kind of power has something to say, and of course African Americans are particularly attuned to the Civil War. Does it work for a long time? I don't know. That's a lot to burden a place with. And it is, of course, once California joins the Union, how much you can change it or yourself through it is going to be limited by its status as a state. After all, the gold rush, the heady days of the gold rush, part of the headiness was you were leaving the United States. California after the war is, of course, in the States, and you can't do so much with a landscape that's tied to national procedures and practices as it may once have been. So I'm going to try to trace this out through the 20th century, or the first decades, maybe the coming of the Great Depression. That's probably about the time I'll do it. And needless to say, I will come back here to do the work. The work has got to be done in a place like the Bancroft. And when I do come back to work in the Bancroft, days which I cannot wait for, frankly, you can bet that on those days that I find what I'm looking for, or find what I wasn't looking for, or on those days that the Bancroft blows my mind through the sheer richness of its scholarly collections, I'll celebrate. I'll go to Chez Panisse, not just for the glass of wine this time. I'll have the whole meal upstairs. Thank you very much.